Hey guys, how are you both doing tonight?
Doing great. Thanks. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, it's great
Also
to
excellent.
have you here with us. So, this is Patrick Rael from, I'm going to say it wrong. I've been practicing all week, but Bowdin College, correct?
Bowdin College. You
Yeah,
got it.
but
Right
yeah,
on.
Bowdin College. And Patrick has a uh, a blog on Board Game Geek, and he is what is your official title? Is it just of history, or
I'm a professor of history. That's right.
okay? And he wrote a book called 88 Years: The Long Death of Slavery in the United States, and some other stuff like how to read a secondary source, which was interesting to me. Uh, I came out of a philosophy background, and I can read some classical Greek and things like that. So I appreciated seeing that. Um, so Patrick is going to talk with us about board games because he has used board games in the classroom, and he's written extensively and done some videos on board games, and he's designed board games. So we'll have some fun tonight. Anything you want to say, Ryan, before we start asking Patrick some questions?
Just the baseline. Christopher has a background in philosophy. I have a background in home construction.
And
Which one of you makes the most money?
Yeah, fair, fair.
Exactly right. Yeah, right now I'm on the negative side of things. This is a passion project. So, and
Yeah.
Sure.
Right now, I'm a full-time dad.
Yep.
So,
Yep, I'm a full
I
time
know what
dad.
that's like.
Yeah.
That's the least paying best job there is.
it has
Yeah.
been a joy.
Yeah. Yeah. My wife is the we're not kind of non traditional that way. So yeah. Anyways, we're gonna get on to the questions. Now that I'm okay. So questions here. How would you explain your relationship to gaming? I just can't kind of give my own introduction of sorts to you, but
Yeah.
um, go ahead.
Oh, I've always been a fan. So, back in junior high school and high school, I started playing games, and it always hung with me. And back in those days, this was a frivolous thing you did that got in the way of your education, and it was basically seen as an obstacle by parents and teachers to doing anything useful. And somehow in the end, we all sort of showed them in a way that games are much more important than we thought they were, or than they thought they were. So I stuck with gaming all through the years of getting my PhD and working in my job and getting established as a scholar. But it was always there, and there are so many fascinating overlaps between these worlds that it just looked like something that had to be spoken to. So I very happily pointed my career a little bit in this direction.
Yeah. When you were um, when you were in California, because you went to UC Berkeley, correct, for your MA and
That's right.
PhD.
That's right.
Did you ever get to go to the GMT open warehouse things when they were they doing that when you were out there, or is that too much of a
I,
time discrepancy?
oh, yeah. So back in those days, I did not have my feet. I was like a lot of those gamers who were sort of high school gamers and then floated out of it, kind of all the families, and came back in. So GMT didn't get on my radar until my re-entry into this thing after the turn of the millennium.
Oh, okay. I only asked because I saw a few GMT games that you've both shared with your students and written about and so forth, and so Ryan and I both we love GMT, and given the opportunity, I'd love to do the nerdy thing, go to their warehouse. So
What,
so go ahead, Ryan.
what were you playing back in high school?
Yeah, we started out with Ogre. I remember Kingmaker just blowing my mind. Um, a good number of hex and counter war games. Those weren't, SPI and Avalon Hellfare, which was never sort of my long suit. It's just sort of seemed like you're playing the same variation on a basic system over and over and over again. I totally respect war gamers, and I've played many war games I've loved. It's just not my first thing. I was always interested in the ways that games could be kind of marshaled in the use of telling history. I mean, literally, the English Wars of the Roses, I knew nothing about until playing Kingmaker, and then it kind of started me off on years of it. I was an undergraduate, as an undergraduate history major, I studied English Civil War and English history largely because of that game. So it can have a huge impact.
Yeah,
Respect
that is really big. What are some historical war games that you would recommend to people now?
Yeah, well, I suppose it depends on kind of where you are and what you're looking for, how heavy you like to play, how committed you are to the kind of standard wargaming fare, how far you're willing to look afield. For my classes, there are a lot of interesting games that make really complicated points about history, but they're kind of unplayable in most settings, right? You have to be a grunyard, you have to be willing to spend weekends in this stuff. And I can't do that in a class session, but I can get a Euro game in at 90 minutes or 2 hours, or I can get a couple turns in of one of those GMT coin games, because those shorter scenarios can go for about 3 hours. So I'm always looking for games that are heavy enough to have an argument, but light enough that you can actually get a session in and the students won't just completely glaze over when you're working with them.
Yeah.
But you got to go heavier than, like Ticket to Ride isn't going to teach anyone much about anything except for geography, So really interested in games with a little bit more meat that kind of draw on a specific history, with a little bit more breadth.
Do you have a go-to maybe for like a freshman or a sophomore who is interested in the idea of historical games but hasn't really ever played anything more than a Ticket to Ride?
Yeah, I think Freedom, the Underground Railroad, is a great entry point for a lot of folks who are kind of interested in history, but are also kind of new to the games. This is a cooperative game. Players work together as Black activists and white abolitionists to help enslaved people in the South flee to the North and then eventually to Canada. You're working cooperatively, so the mechanics and the architecture of the game are really help to make the game's point. And it's a game that's sort of designed with teaching history in mind. But oftentimes these sort of educational games aren't really very good games, right? This is not that. Freedom is a game that is both good mechanically, a completely sound modern example of board game technology, but it also is very conscious of the historical point that it's making. History is not just a backdrop to that game.
Yeah, absolutely.
I played a demo of that at Gen Con or Origins a few years ago. Mechanically very good, very heavy, very immersive. Definitely enjoyed it. Was uncomfortable with like the experience.
And that's a game about slavery that was sort of built to help overcome that reticence of like playing slavery. If you play Puerto Rico, which is the classic example, you're engaging in slavery that whole game, even though the word doesn't appear in the rule book and it's not really intended to be represented in that game. There are other games, I've just been writing about this, there are other games that depict the history of Atlantic slavery, but they let you kind of practice it. Games like Struggle of Empires or Endeavor, Age of Sail, or Colonial. Those are all games where you can practice slavery incidentally and you get kind of punished for it. So the game is still making a kind of a moral point against slavery, but it lets you play it. In Freedom, you don't really have that option. You are clearly working against it. No one is given that kind of difficult moral choice.
And that's a really important point. I love Puerto Rico. Played it tons and tons of times, but in the last couple of years, I tend to shy away from it just because I hadn't even thought about that, and then somebody brought that point up, and I'm like, oh, yeah, that is what we're doing. There's no way that that's not what we're doing in this game.
I'm going to be on Wikipedia after this.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a fascinating case because the game isn't, it's a Euro, right? It's a box of clever mechanics. It's not, and it doesn't need to be themed around something that's difficult. It's not like the game's point was to take on a difficult historical subject. It was back in 2002 when that game was made.
Yeah.
It's just kind of a safe, generic kind of theme for that a lot of Euros kind of took on in some way or another. So I think what it shows is that our sensibilities have changed quite a bit over 2 decades, and that's probably to the better, right?
Yeah. I mean, and since we're there, could you break down the in some of your writings, particularly the essay that Ryan and I read? Um, there's a technical distinction between discursive and ludic elements in games. Could you break that down for somebody who is into games, enjoys games, but has never heard those words, has maybe never thought
Yeah.
about the difference there about how a game makes its argument?
Yeah, what I'm really trying to do is think about that question, how a game makes its argument. And when we think about educational games, I mean, you can easily imagine a bad one, right? Like a trivia game that doesn't play that well as a game, but it's got a lot of history in it. And the problem with that is that those kinds of games don't work. Nobody wants to play them, right? These things have to be good as games, and they have to make their messages come across as games. Otherwise, it's like chocolate covered broccoli is the kind of phrase for these educational games. Like nobody really wants to play them. So how do you make a game, the mechanics of which speak to the issue that the game, make a point of some kind? So, this is ludic rhetoric, right? This is procedural rhetoric, is Ian Bogoth's term. I think that applies to a wide range of digital systems. So I want to call it ludic rhetoric because this is the kind of things that only games can do. Mm-hmm. And the way games make their points is through their mechanics. So Brenda Romero has this phrase, the mechanic is the message, sort of a riff on Marshall McLuhan's the medium is the message. And what she's saying is that this is the unique way that games make their arguments is not through, it's partly through their surface and what they say they're about and what the card text is and what the designer's notes say. That's the discursive rhetoric. That's the explanation in text. The ludic rhetoric is the part of the game that is built on the mechanics. So, for example, if you're playing a game about elections, very often involve mechanics around actual voting. Or if you're playing games around art collecting, there's very often an auction mechanic involved. Like modern art by Rainer Knizia or something like that. Yeah. So this is the idea that it's the way games make their message come across is through their mechanics. That's the ludic rhetoric. And then the discursive is the piece about the words that describe what the game is supposed to be
about. I know all of this because I was reading Google as I read your paper.
So I'm sorry, I missed what you said.
I get what you're saying, but that's because as I read the paper, I had to look up a lot of words.
Should I rephrase things?
No, I got it. I was just making a joke about.
I think what Ryan's point is too, and we've been kind of talking about this before you joined us tonight, is that sometimes, I mean, and this can speak to a lot of things, but sometimes there can be two conversations happening, even in the United States, and I think this is appropriate for where we're at right now. There can be a conversation for people who want to dig a little bit more and whether it's self-teach and things like that and write a little bit more eloquently like you do. And then there are people who are okay with the surface level of things. And I think the gaming community embodies that same, and this is my opinion here, but I think the gaming community can embody that same divide right now too. There are people who just want the games to be the games and don't try to tell me what the game is about. and then there are a good number of people right now who are asking the question, okay, what is underlying this game as we play it? And that speaks to a lot of what people have been upset with and want to see change and want to see, we'll put it positively, want to see get better. Is that games, so we'll go back to Puerto Rico, games can tell their story differently, right? And uh, so go ahead. Did you have something you want to add there?
Yeah, it's a fascinating issue, right? These are, I think what's happened with board games is the same thing that happened most recently with video games, same thing that happened with film, historical novels. These are what we would think of as issues of cultural representation of some kind, you know. And I'm talking here about the representation of a past that includes, you know, Atlantic slavery. But more generally, this is about the way people of African descent are depicted in our popular culture, which has a long and infamous history in this country.
Yeah.
And for a long time, board games were kind of, I think safe might be a fair way to put it. A lot of gamers felt that they were safe from that there was, you know, relative to the bigger entertainment markets, a small industry, niche audiences, people who, you know, were sort of almost underground for a lot of the time when those other questions of representation were hitting those other mediums. Now, with board games selling like they've never done before, with them doing things that they hadn't before, all these questions are emerging. And so we might variously lament that or celebrate it, but it does seem to be a fact of our, you know, of our public lives right now.
Yeah.
Would you agree?
One of Ryan's favorite designers is somebody I follow on Twitter, is Eric Lang. And then one of my designers I appreciate for her viewpoints is Elizabeth Hargrave. And they both have spent a lot of time over the last few weeks saying, yeah, we need to do a lot more to lift up some other voices in that project that you're talking about.
I mean, gaming.
Go ahead.
It's you just spend time with it. Twilight Struggle. I adore that game. I've mentioned this in the podcast before, so I'll keep it brief. But no interest in the Cold War. Played it, a lot more interest in the Cold War. But they all don't have to be GMT games to be able to provide at least some level of immersiveness and education, and maybe spark some intellectual curiosity. And I don't expect every game designer to do the extra work to make their game that, but I think that honestly doing that work, making games in the future, leads to a lot more immersion and enjoyment of the game and builds a better community. My opinion, you know.
I think there's a reason why people love theme, you know, and why abstracts don't sell as well as other games. And you know, the knock on the old Knizia style Euros was that they were sort of collections of mechanics that could take virtually any theme. You know, they could be reskinned easily or whatever. And you know, I don't myself have a problem with that as long as the game systems are good. But I think you're right, Ryan. There's like a popular people want to be connected with their games. They want to be able to narrate the story, and they want the game to help them do that in a way. And so, yeah, that's, I think, part of this increased sensitivity to these kinds of questions. And that's good, right? We expand the community of gamers. You get many, many more people involved. You start hitting diverse communities that you hadn't before. These are really, this is critical. This is for the health of the hobby and the industry and all the lives it supports. So, you know, this is good. I understand there are people who are always like, oh, we didn't want to have to think about these issues. Gaming for me was a solace from all those concerns and public life and all this kind of stuff. It was where I could go hide. And it's like, well, keep hiding, keep going. Like, no one's compelling you to encounter these issues. But none of us have a right to sort of say no one can speak about the connection between the way we play and, you know, what is represented in what we play.
Right.
Making our own entertainment off of others' misery is something that can justly be called out in the public sphere, I would say.
Oh, absolutely. Yep. Yeah. That's a really good way to put it. So going back to Freedom, that's by Academy, right?
That's right.
Yeah. Okay. I've played quite a few of their games, and I mean, they all share some similar mechanics. Well, I should say that line, that kind of uh, well, there's like 17. Is it 1776?
1775. That's the only other one I know from them.
Okay,
But
yeah, 75,
I
and
think I
then
played
there's
that.
the French and Indian War one,
that's
um,
right.
and they have then the Viking one, and all of those share some similar similar mechanics, but I think Freedom is the best one of them because of the way it tells its narrative. Um, I really like how you put that about narrative, and that goes back to something that we've been thinking about a lot. It is the experience of gaming and how gaming can bring us together. And so, yeah, just again emphasizing your point that
Yeah.
it's good to have a narrative that brings people together. Um, if I can say it that way, is that fair to summarize that part of what you're saying?
I'm all for that.
Okay. So on that note, what are some of your best gaming experiences you've had, either with students or just the places that you've um, played in the
Oh my
past?
goodness. Well, but playing with students is a blast because they are, bad pump. They're very game, right? They're ready for anything. They'll try anything. So let's see. We put them through Colonial, Europe's Empires Overseas, which is just a game about expansion and colonization. Um, then we played Liberty or Death, Harold Buchanan's coin game in the GMT series, which is far and away the heaviest game we went after, and that was fascinating because like that's a game that makes a real point in the way that it's constructed and the way the cards go. So and it dovetails very nicely with academic history. Like I found scholarship that very nicely speaks to the things that Harold designed into that game. So that was really cool. We played Founding Fathers, which is about the creation of the Constitution, Jolly Roger games. 2 games on Lewis and Clark by the same French designer, Cedric Chaboussi, I believe his name
Yeah,
is.
yeah.
He did his first game on Lewis and Clark, which is basically a worker placement kind of thing. And then he had another game on Lewis and Clark in him, which is a little bit lighter. It's called Discovery, and it's really good. And it's really fun to take the same designer, same theme, 2 radically different designs and put them in conversation with each other. So, so that kind of stuff is always a blast.
What's your guilty pleasure game when you're hanging out with your buds?
I have no guilt. I have no guilt at all about Mansions of Madness, Journeys in Middle Earth. Yeah, no, I'm a man. I like trash galore. There's
How are you?
no end to it.
Have you finished Journeys in Middle Earth, or are you still playing through it?
We crashed out in one of our efforts, and we're about to crash out in a second. So, I don't know. Have you guys played that?
I have. I don't think Ryan has yet. So this is just a person-to-person question. I was wondering, related to the narrative mechanic, how you felt it was doing in terms of allowing you to feel like you have your own volition within the game, or like, do you feel like it's this is a personal question? Do you feel like it's pulling you in a certain direction that is unavoidable, or not?
Yeah, that's a good. My big. It wants you to do stuff.
Yeah.
You just never know exactly what it is, and you never know whether to bite on that thing. Maybe it's just a power up. Maybe it's a diversion. And so every scenario you're confronted with that, and then the big sort of overarching narrative. We keep failing it, but it keeps taking us there. So. I think I prefer mansions, frankly, because each one is kind of standalone, and I just dig the Lovecraft, mythos. So, but they're both good. If you want to think about like some card-driven games, though, or I mean, that whole question about being driven through the narrative, that's a really interesting one about card-driven war games and other sort of history-related things. I've been thinking a lot about that lately. I'm curious to see if you guys have thoughts on that, or are there certain games that seem to drive a stronger sense of narrative?
I mean, that's interesting, right? The one I really need to play with Ryan, that I've gotten probably 12 to 15 in over the last year is Watergate. I think Watergate distills a lot of what Twilight Struggle did originally, mechanically.
Watergate.
Oh, you haven't played Watergate?
No, it's not.
Oh,
I know Making of the President. I didn't know Watergate. Cool.
so Watergate is a by Capstone here in Cincinnati. It's you're playing the press corps and President Nixon, and as you play, you either play your cards for their point value
Right.
to go back
Yeah.
and forth in this little tug of war, or you're playing them for the events, just like in Twilight Struggle. And that's why I say it distills that. It is that idea of do I want this to have the power of the event, or do I want it to matter
Right.
for
Yeah.
back and forth? Um, and what is interesting to me is how it seems like, and I and it sounds like 12 to 15 would be enough to have an idea, but I haven't played against the same opponent enough to know if this is true or not. But it seems like there's a bent towards Nixon built into the game,
Mhm.
and he has a slight edge that if you don't play exactly right as the press, he's going to come out on top. And that's if that's true. Um, so it's just anecdotal, not empirical, right? But if it were true, that's an interesting story that's telling, right? That the press has to work that hard to
Yeah.
defeat this corrupt president. Uh,
Huh. So it feels a little bit asymmetrical, like both sides don't have the same fight.
well, yeah, they definitely have different events that they can do, and
Yeah.
so yeah, I highly recommend it if you like two-player games. It's not hard to learn. You have the whole little punch board there that is your board in front of you, and Nixon can make it so that you can't access some of the witnesses and stuff. So thematically, it's a lot of fun if you like
That's
political
great.
history, things like that.
Yeah. And of course, Twilight Struggle is just set a whole new mark on everything, and that game tells great stories. You know, I love that.
I don't know. Have you? Uh, well, you played. Ryan played the Queen one. We've talked about it a couple times.
The Virgin Queen.
The Virgin Queen.
I played Here I Stand. Not.
And that's what I played. It's not the Virgin Queen. It was Here I Stand.
Oh, you've played Here I Stand. Okay, so you both have played Here I Stand. So that's one we all have in common. What do you think about that game, Patrick? Because that's
I love it.
okay.
So that's just it's remarkable. Like that's a game that tells a big story, but it just completely makes sense. You know, it's like all the player positions make sense. They're all a little bit different. They all these overlapping battle, you know, kinds of conflicts that are going on. These little side things like England and the New World. Just a gorgeous game that gets so much play value, so much history in there, without a lot of rules overload. You know, it's really not that heavy given what's, you know, the story that it tells.
Right.
What did y'all think of it?
Oh, everything not on the same page. So what I'm curious about is, as a historian, how do you? Because it is telling a fairly specific story. Um, as a historian, how do you see that game?
Yeah.
Is there a lens that would be different than the average person coming to that game?
Well, I can't speak. That is about a field that I don't have a ton of field expertise on, right? So I'm not 16th century Europe guy. I'm Atlantic world, antebellum America, going back to the colonial days. So I kind of just go on my general sense, right? I'm more like an average player with that, and it feels good, right? It feels like you've got the religious battle overlapping the political battles, and everything just kind of, it makes sense given, everything else I've encountered about that time.
Yeah, I like the tug and pull. It's been a little while, 2 years since I played it, but um, thinking back, I like the tug and pull between the different elements in that way.
Yeah, yeah, it's really neat. I mean, but the general kinds of things are um, over these historical games is how do they try to model something that is at least looks like history, and how does it work? So, like in the classroom, I don't expect students to play Twilight Struggle and get the sequence right. You're not going to get the sequence right in Twilight Struggle, but you play that game 4 or 5 times, or you play Here I Stand 4 or 5 times, and you really, if you've never encountered these subjects before, you really do get a very strong sense of flavor and feel. And I think for a lot of students, it gives them a kind of a backstop, almost kind of a safety net, so that when they then go into the history, they know who the players were. They know something about the basic geography. I think it supports their learning in a way that is really useful.
Yeah, one of your students in the video that you have on your webpage said something about like, I, when I read a textbook, it's just facts and numbers to me. But playing these, I felt like I had a better understanding of who these people were.
Yeah.
And that was
Could be
interesting to me.
dangerous.
Go ahead.
Could be dangerous. Could be a false sense of security. So we always want to stay on our critical toes. But as long as we're thoughtful about that process, it's just like watching a film or something. You wouldn't watch the Mel Gibson in The Patriot and think that you'd seen a documentary on the American Revolution.
Wait a second. No,
I'm sorry.
he boiled down his kids led soldiers and then into bullets and shot people with them.
That could have been real for all I know.
The only Patriot to me that's historically accurate is the Steven Seagal Patriot.
I missed that one. I've seen some other Seagal.
It's awful.
I bet it's a fine take on American history.
I am so off course now. Thanks, Ryan. With so going to that point, whether it's now I can't even think of the name of the movie. Thanks, Ryan. The Patriot. Yeah, that or like Gone with the Wind. Right. These are period pieces from a director's point of view, and that's a whole nother discussion, right? That people could be like, is there even a director's point of view? Does the movie actually have a point? I'm of the opinion that they do, by who is villainized, so forth. But what we make jokes of. Do games, and we've kind of already touched on this, but do games do similar things? And how they share their mechanics, and if so, could you maybe give an example for those who aren't thinking about games that way?
It's a good question. So I think about games as a medium, like film as a medium, like historical fiction as a medium, like poetry as a medium, and so each of these is doing some work of representation, but it has its own unique way of doing that. Or there's a range of ways that poetry works. There's a range of ways that cinema works. There's a range of ways that games work. Mm-hmm. But one thing that's common to all these questions of representation is what is intended versus what just comes out, right? So if you're looking at a piece of literature, sometimes, famous works, you can derive meaning from them that is not there on the surface. So someone will do a Freudian reading of Shakespeare or something like that and find all this stuff about Shakespeare that, they're going to claim is true, and Shakespeare never seemed to have any intention to say or not. And like any form can do this, right? So a game like Puerto Rico didn't intend to make a statement about slavery, I'm pretty sure, but it wound up making one, right? So there's a consequence or an effect of these choices that is sometimes completely independent of the intent that goes into making whatever we're talking about. So in a game like Freedom, it's the opposite, right? This is a game that's very aware of what it's doing, what it wants to do, and it tells you very, very clearly in both its mechanics and its discursive rhetoric, like it says. But then there are these other games that might not be so overt in what they're saying, and it might not be so aware or care so much about what they're saying. Yet that's often where the kind of dangerous work of representation happens, right? No one's sort of like if you're thinking about the negative example of racial stereotypes in American history, very few of even the worst purveyors were like, I'm doing this for a bad reason, right? They thought it was a good reason to do what they were doing.
Right.
No one ever tries to get in trouble, or rarely tries to, but you do anyway. It's the latent stuff. It's the kind of, whatever the values or the commitments are that come out sort of latently in the work that we produce. Those are the things that we want to be most aware of.
Yeah.
So
In Gone with the Wind, I'm sorry, just to give you an example, you get it's like that movie was forever considered pretty much a flat, neutral, almost value-free depiction of, it was the representation of the Civil War, and particularly Reconstruction. And of course, it's incredibly racist. It is suffused with racism. And so, from our perspective, we can look back and see how all those values sort of emerge from the film, even when they might not have been the overt intent.
still haven't seen it.
I don't think you need to. You could save yourself 4 hours.
Just watch the Patriot.
Nonsense.
Watch the Patriot again.
There you go.
That's a really interesting phrase. I don't know if you meant to use it or not, but you said the dangerous work of representation.
Yeah.
But it's related to an idea that you've written about. So without getting too heavy necessarily, or too bent on from one perspective, what do you mean by that? The dangerous work of representation, and how could we? Let's take a game, for example, like a GMT game that seems to be fairly neutral value wise, like Shenandoah, right? Shannon, I don't know. Have you played Shenandoah?
I haven't.
Okay. So. Just take it that it's a Civil War game, that is your specialty, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
So
it's a Civil War game. Got it.
Yep, Civil War game about a particular battle, and the protagonists are mainly in the game are just two armies doing their thing. Somebody could say that's just value neutral, right?
Right.
It is. Mm-hmm. I just threw a lot at you, so answer what you feel like answering.
This is the heart of the issue, right? And these are the kinds of concerns that people raise. I think it was in the wake of the Dylan Roof shooting in Charleston when he murdered Black churchgoers as a white to spark race war. And this is about the argument over Confederate battle flags flying in Southern state houses. Like that was one of the inciting issues for him. And shortly after that, Amazon just stripped their shelves. You could not go online and find anything with Confederate battle flag on it. You couldn't find a war game or anything like that. Yep. And I mean, everyone has an opinion about this, right? And everyone at the time, everyone had an opinion. And there's no shortage of opinions. So I don't really particularly need to share mine on this. It's more about the phenomenon, right? These are not neutral issues. The Civil War was over 150 years ago, but we are still fighting it. These are very much alive in our culture and our public discourse. So we just have to acknowledge that, to sort of, there's one approach that would kind of say, well, why do we have to cope with all that? And it's like, well, because you're a citizen in this country, you're a human in this planet. You have to contend with this in some way. It doesn't mean that, everyone has to be, go to extraordinary lengths or something, but just a kind of awareness that these are legitimate issues that people are talking about. I think that's step one, right?
not being cool with Confederates is like not an apolitical stance, you know, like, well, I don't like to be involved with politics. Like, yeah, no, stars and bars is definitely a political statement, bro.
Yeah, because what you're doing when you're consuming those products with the Confederate flag on them, or it's like you're sort of reinforcing that symbol and what it means, right? And there are a lot of people, now this is huge arguments over this. Well, I don't stand for the Confederacy and slavery, I stand for the Confederate soldiers. And I mean, there are different ways that people sort of do gymnastics around that kind of stuff. But ultimately, that's what these questions of representation are all about, or like, how does our culture continually reinforce in our minds, often in very latent ways that are hard to appreciate or articulate to ourselves, the strengthening of these images. And it's just, that's how racist imagery has worked in this country since before the minstrel stage emerged, all up through, Bugs Bunny and blackface and the whole 9 yards. So this is a history that my students, being so young, have not encountered that much of, but it's not that far past.
Right. For some people, it's still their reality.
Yeah.
I think. I mean, you said it much better, but the idea that the way that things are embedded in our culture, it's worth that knowing what those things are, and that's what it means to be aware of the dangerous work of representation. At least part of it. At least part of it. Yeah.
It's about, for me, it's about helping my students sort of think critically about what they're consuming in terms of popular culture. There's a lot of history being taught in this country, sort of lament the state of the profession, and history majors are in fact declining. But there's more history in this culture than ever before. It's just not being taught at necessarily colleges, or it's being taught in movies and in TV shows and board games and video games and places like that. So it seems, to me, it seems important to help students kind of gain the critical apparatus that gives them some choice over this, right? That you don't have to consume this in a thoughtless way. You have an option about how you encounter this.
Absolutely.
Man, I'm just thinking of the day that some kid heads down his road of radicalization through playing a poorly thought out board game. Like, I got into these bad ideas because I started playing this game with my buddies.
Well, just think about, remember the horror stories in the 80s of the kids who, played Dungeons and Dragons, got, down in the tunnels or whatever, or young man who suicided. He was playing Amber, which is a big mud. There's a lot of, there is this dark side that games kind of represent. There's this pull. And I remember as a high schooler wanting more than anything just to play games all the time and not do school. So I felt that pull. There's they are powerful, which is part of their awesomeness. But
I definitely LARPed during the 90s when there was cults and stuff based around it. Wow. I'm going to retract my previous statement, though. I think anybody that gets radicalized by a board game probably just use that as an excuse to keep going with their bad ideas.
They were going to get radicalized by something.
Yeah.
Well, don't you think it's more just the fact that it further embeds the culture of whatever that bad idea is? Yeah. And so if there's something that promotes that, especially if it promotes it in a way that is, seems innocent, and so they're doing all these things, and here's one more thing, and I happen to enjoy that thing, so you add some part of their critical thinking plus pleasure and plus the culture of it. It's just going to further embed the bad idea into what they're doing. So why should the board go ahead?
The Iron Cross is on my Flames of War miniatures. So why can't I, wear it on my arm patch?
Right.
This is sarcasm, hypothetically.
right? Sort of slippery slope thing, though.
Yeah. I don't think we need to take it that way, but I mean, like,
I mean, Confederate battle flag, just because when Amazon took all that stuff down, that was when I was still on Facebook, and there was a lot of conversations about like, well, there's all these symbols of Nazism in board gaming, especially like hex encounters, advanced squad leader, and it exists everywhere. And then, I mean, but I think that the problem isn't the symbols. The problem is what are those games trying to do with those symbols?
right.
Well,
and that goes back to Patrick's point.
Yeah.
With
I'm in my lane saying it. Yeah.
what are the mechanics?
Yeah.
No, but
go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, they're incredibly difficult issues, right? Because I don't think that everybody who purchases a game with a Confederate flag on it, somewhere in it, is necessarily doing a bad thing. It certainly doesn't mean they're malevolent in some way. There's a kind of rough. It would be good if we could bring some nuance to this, right? And if the broader conversations could permit a little bit more flexibility on this, because like what tends to happen with the concerns about representation is we end up shutting things down, right? So it's all about, okay, we can't do this, we can't do that, we can't do that. And people resent that, right? They don't like feeling like they're confined in boxes.
Oh yeah, nobody wants to be told what they can do. Yeah.
There's something that's about the whole, I think about this. It's like there's something about that we are engaged in play, right? That's what this is about, is play. And so it doesn't mean that all play isn't dangerous. There can be very dangerous sorts of play, but there's something about the play that we want to retain, right? We want to keep a space of flexibility. We want to keep a place of imagination. That's actually how we make historical connections with other people, right? We create this kind of empathy. You have to be willing to kind of put yourself in positions or in personae that you might not ever choose to in real life. That is kind of the function. So if we shut it down too much or it's a hard point to make, because I totally understand the concerns that people bring, and I know the history and the consequences of it. But I do always hope that we can remember why we were doing it in the first place, which is to kind of celebrate an imaginative exercise that we want to be constructive.
Yeah. I think I think that Ryan's poking at it in a kind of playful way, but
I wasn't trying to poke. I was just.
Oh, you weren't? Okay.
No. I was just trying to say that it. I don't know. I wasn't trying to poke. I was in agreement. Maybe
okay.
I get a little sarcastic in my pitch sometimes as a way to interject humor, maybe where it shouldn't be.
Well, I mean, in all seriousness, we know we know that like play can be an important way. I was just reading about Roald Dahl this morning and why kids love his books, even though they're super dark. They're sometimes they're very against responsibility and authority figures and all those things that like we want kids to do those things, but and sometimes they have disgusting things in them, and then like cursing, things like that. All things that we don't really want kids to model, but they love his books because of the way that they deal with the imaginative side of darker things, and that's helpful for kids so that they know how to deal with those things in a different form when they come up in real life for them. And I think games can deal help us to deal with those things in real life too, whether it's a historical war game. And for some of us, we want to defeat the Nazis in that game, and that and even thinking about a historical war game from the Civil War. I mean, Ryan, you and I both know the guys that we want to avoid. I don't know. I've met a couple. The guys that show up and they only want to cosplay as the South, and they only play historical war games. I don't know. Maybe I'm going on too long about this, but
Well,
I think most people have the critical apparatus to tell the difference between somebody who's embedded in a culture that's problematic with a game and playing one game because we want to work through the play of it, like Patrick is talking about in a helpful way.
Within gaming, like there's a problem in the 40K community. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Warhammer 40K. I mean, it was made by a whole bunch of guys who were in like pushing back against like 80s Nazi fascist scene in Europe and like Judge Dredd, and it's all like irony or whatever, like it's designed in this over the top way to kind of make fun of these ideas. And then 30 years later, some guys with high end tights, those are the haircuts that I call the people who wear the alt, people with bad ideas, in my opinion. They now like identify with
some of the factions.
obvious, obvious, I cannot think of the word, but yeah, they identify with this in like a good way. And it's it was never intended that way.
Yeah. They see the ones that were intended to be villains as the moral superior agents now. Yeah.
This is the danger, though, of being too clever with your signs, right? So you have this motif of, I'm going to make these guys are going to out fascist the fascist kind of thing. But you put that sign out, that's the intent you put it out with, but then what happens to it, it is received as well, right? And those people might not care or, I mean, we see this all the time, isn't that that frog meme, Pepe the Frog or something sort of transmutated from something into an alt-right thing.
Yeah.
So these little sort of cultural memes are slippery entities. And I think it's an interesting example.
The dog whistles nowadays they're constantly changing.
I think if we're having the type of discussion that we are about games, so you're going to be aware of these distinctions, and you can handle nuance. Is my general feeling on it.
There are though some ways that, I mean, classicists, so people who study classics, are like that profession, that branch of scholarship is concerned very much with the ways that certain right-wing voices are kind of appropriating a lot of classics, and classics they're trying to diversify that field a lot. Medieval history has it's a real problem in medieval studies right now, this what we call medievalism, which is kind of the use or the appropriation of these medieval themes in the service of other things, some of which are associated with the alt-right pretty explicitly. The Volkswanderung and, skinhead appropriation of Viking motifs, all that kind of stuff. So
some of the stuff in Poland right now and Eastern Europe.
Yeah. So again, it's great to have a gaming world where we don't have to have that outside world intrude in us, but we should remember it's not too far off. It really is right there.
Only 38,000 years in the future.
38,000.
Going back to
40K joke, sorry.
40K. Well, let's finish up with this on something like, man, we went heavier than I was expecting to.
I'm telling you, that got dark.
Yeah. And again, really appreciate you being willing to discuss with us tonight.
I'm going to figure out how to follow blogs on BGG so that because Christopher might post your blog up here and post edit and then show me how to follow blogs so I can read it because it seems really interesting.
Well, thanks. It'd be great. I'm always happy to hear comments and share thoughts. I think these are fascinating issues.
So actually, two things before. So the first one is I'm excited to try your not a train game if you finish it.
Oh, cool.
About airships, right? That's what I was reading.
There's airship technology is possible. Okay. It's basically a pick up and deliver game, sort of a Euro model, and I'm trying to get a game crafter version so that hard copies would be available. But if you're into train games, yes, please check it out.
Get my suspenders.
We talk about a train game at least once every episode. We both aren't big train guys, but the store I used to work at, the guys would play for. They would start at like 6 or 7, and they would play till 3 or 4 in the morning. And
Like Teen XX.
yeah, 18XX.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My rule is that all the old guys play train games and historicals, and they've been gaming since longer than I've been alive. So I should just transition into that now because obviously those are the best games.
We both already have the haircut for it. We're both bald and ready for it. So my last light question is, what are you playing with your family or friends right now? What are you enjoying?
Oh man, we haven't been able to get together for a year, so it's been tough for a big Raymond group. So my partner and I do Journeys of Middle Earth and Mansions of Madness, and sometimes we get together with close family and usually younger folks and lighter kind of fare. Codenames is always a big favorite, stuff like that. But so mostly because we've been under with the virus, it's given me a chance to work on my own designs like that train game and to play around with some of these other things. So I've had some of these slavery games on the table, and I just did a video that's on the blog about the way these games handle slavery. So that's really what I've been doing. Like last one was Jeff Davis. What is it? Jeff Davis, The Confederate War, which is it's a solitaire, and it is chrome-tastic. It is really a beautiful little solitaire game with a lot of cool bells and whistles that still work very elegantly. So I'm having fun with that, and it depicts slavery as well. So I have an academic interest in it.
Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing your time with us tonight. It was, I think, a really great discussion. Anything else you want to say, Ryan, before we head out?
No, I got some good stuff to think about. I've been doing that a lot lately, taking time to digest and figure out my position and check my place in the world and what I can do about it. And there's some good discussion for all that kind of stuff because I'm selfish. That's what I'm taking away from this. Like other people can watch it and they can do that kind of stuff too, but I'm just focused on what I,
Anything else you want to add, Patrick, before we head out?
Good. Thank you, gentlemen, very much for having me on. I wish you the best of luck with your cast.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it.
Take care.